Great to see you. As Stephen said, it is Philippians, our new series, A Life Worth Living. Who wants to hear about that? Yeah, come on, a life worth living. We want to hear about that. So if you turn to Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 26, you can get it on your smartphone or your tablet or in a proper old book. So here we go. Are you ready? Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me is actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I'm in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I'm torn between these two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Last November, so just a couple of months ago, I found myself standing on this kind of high hill, not quite mountain, very, very high hill, overlooking the Jordanian valley, right across the Jordan from the Israel side. And it was this staggering view. It was such a privilege to stand there. And as we gathered, a few friends had all gathered and gone, and we were standing looking over the Jordan River, the place where Joshua had marched across and gone into the promised land, the place where Jacob had wrestled with the angel. That was all in view of where we were. And as we stood there looking at it, we decided we'd take some moments alone just to talk to God. And as we did that, suddenly this wind blew up and this sandstorm kind of came down this valley. And then over our heads, this big, thick cloud started moving across. And then the thunder started and the lightning started flashing. And I stood there and it was this epic moment. Only moments before it had been blue sky and sunshine. There were amazing photos of just the most glorious day. And then suddenly it all shifted, all changed in this moment as the storm moved in. And I stood on this hill as then the rain began and it became torrential rain with thunder and lightning over this valley as I stood and shouted into the rain. I don't know if anyone else has ever done that. Is that just me? But I was shouting away. I was having a conversation with God. And it was one of the most profound, incredible moments for a whole load of reasons that maybe one day I'll share. But it got so bad, I had to go in and find shelter. Found this kind of platform that had been built and we got underneath there because we had to shelter from the storm. It had become so strong. Now, I don't know if you like hanging out in storms. I love a good storm. I like actually being inside when it's a storm because you kind of feel that safe feeling, don't you? But the reality is we can get caught in storms, and actually we get caught in storms in life all the time. Not just physical storms when the weather moves in, but storms in our lives can move in so quickly. 1 minute it can be blue skies and sunshine, and then the next minute the storm has moved in. It kind of comes at a pace. Sometimes it comes and we weren't expecting it at all. Maybe it's a relationship issue, maybe there's something at work, maybe there's all kinds of challenges in your life. Somebody wants to come against you for some reason, and the storm builds around you. Some storms have a sense of authority and the power of God at work in them. That storm in Israel certainly had that for me. But some storms seem to be beyond our control and seem to come against us. But how could we choose to live life in all its fullness? How could we move forward in life and live this living life, whatever the circumstance, whatever's going on, whatever seems to be thrown at? How could we stand in our faith? How could we stand with Jesus? How can we stand just to get through every day, whatever the circumstance, even when the storms move in? The Apostle Paul is a profound inspiration as somebody who learned what it meant to stand in the midst of storms. He's the person who wrote that letter to the Philippians that I just read from. And as he was writing this letter, he almost begs us to raise our resilience, to weather the storms of life, and to be able to keep going whatever the circumstance. The context of this passage right here in Philippians is that Paul is in prison. He's not in a dark dungeon in the depths of Rome. He is around Rome, but he's actually under house arrest at this stage. He's confined, his freedom has been taken from him. He's in chains, and he's chained to somebody from the palace guard 24/7. He knows this is not a good situation. Some of us might think, oh, that's all right, he'll be all right, and give it a few weeks, serve his sentence, move on. But he's there because he's so passionate about Jesus that he's causing a commotion. The known world are waking up to the phenomenon of Jesus Christ, and Paul is at the front end of making that happen. And so now he's in chains, and some of his friends, others who he has known, have died for their faith. And so he knows this could end badly. It's not a great situation. It could be described as a significant storm. But he is our inspiration, that whatever the circumstance, you can learn to stand. You can push on. And so the mathematicians in the room will know that a triangle is apparently the strongest shape. It can withstand the greatest force. And so this strongest shape is going to illustrate for us, and we're going to take three things, the three sides that make up the ability for Paul to stand whatever the circumstance. And we're going to learn from this passage this evening. The first one is this: Paul is an absolute master at spotting opportunity. He spots opportunity in everything. I love the way this passage begins. He starts in that context, in prison, held, no freedom, worrying about the state of his life, and he says this: now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. That's what he's interested in, this good news of Jesus being known even more. And this situation, he knows, is actually served to help advance the gospel. The situation he's in is that this palace guard are surrounding him. And you and I might look at that situation and think, look, I'm confined, my freedom's gone, I can't go and tell anyone about Jesus, I can't advance the gospel in the way that I've been doing. I've been planting churches across the known world, but now I'm limited to this house and it's not a good situation. We would complain. I know I would. I'd be in a situation of complaint. But Paul is spotting the opportunity. He might be the one who's captive, but sitting next to him is a captive audience. 24/7, this palace guard are on a rota to sit with Paul. The palace guard were one of the finest regiments in the Roman army. Between 10,000 and 16,000 soldiers in that regiment, and a number of them would have had to go and sit with Paul under house arrest in this house. This finest regiment. And Paul would have taken every opportunity. People were allowed to visit him, to come bring him food or encouragement or have a conversation with him under this situation of his prison. And as they came, I imagine Paul leaning in and going, hey, do you remember that time when I hated Christians? I wanted to get rid of Christians. I wanted to put Christians in prison. And here am I in prison as a Christian, telling people about that. And do you remember that time I was walking on the road to Damascus and I was going to persecute Christians? And then I had this open vision in which Jesus, who had ascended into heaven, appeared to me and asked me why I was against him. And I fell on my knees and I was blinded for 3 days until some Christian came to find me and healed me of my blindness. And now I know that I'm to follow Jesus. He would tell these stories, and the palace guard, this finest regiment, would hear every single story, influencing at the center of Rome, even though he's in trouble. He tells stories of salvation when the Holy Spirit broke out amongst unlikely people. Just last week, I was in the barracks just up the road. There's a barracks just on Hyde Park. It's the really tall building, and there's regiments in there. One of the regiments in there is the Household Cavalry. Now, those are the guys who dress up in really nice stuff, and they kind of do the ceremonial things around Buckingham Palace and lead the way for the Queen, and they're part of the army. And my godson had just graduated into this regiment last week, so we went to celebrate. Here's a photo of him. I dare you to try and get a selfie with someone from the Household Cavalry doing that face. You won't get it because they're trained to be really serious and standing up there, but anyway, I got him to do it. So there we go. That's Jacob. He just got put into essentially like the palace guard, literally guarding the palace, right here in our context. The amazing thing about Jacob right there is that a few weeks after joining the army, he met Jesus. He came face to face with the reality that his life only made sense in Jesus, that he was at home in Jesus. And he gave his life to Jesus, and it changed everything. And because it was so real to him, he just started telling people who were right in front of him. He started spotting the opportunities and telling people. And so he began talking to his friends who were in the army all about this, and they started giving their life to Jesus. When he was based at Wynter, he started a club called Beer and Burgers because he knew that would attract some of the guys from his regiment to come because there's free beer and burgers. And told them, sat around with beer and burgers, telling the story, the good news of Jesus, just like Paul was telling those soldiers. He was telling these soldiers. And so momentum grew, and he's only been in the barracks there for a few weeks as he's entered into this new regiment. And already, just 2 weeks ago, he brought one of the guys to the 4:30 service right here, someone who didn't have faith, doesn't know Jesus. And there's Jacob making the most of every opportunity. Do you spot the opportunities? Do you see what's possible in front of you? Now, Jacob's chosen to be in the palace guard. Paul had not chosen to be in prison. But whether you know where you are and you've chosen to be there, whether you're happy with your job, you're in your role, whether you've chosen to be in London, or whether you feel like you're in a situation you don't want to be in, it's too hard, it's difficult, a health issue or a job that you're stuck in, whatever it is, can you spot the opportunity? Because God is for you, he's with you, and he wants to use you in that space, just as he used Paul to speak to that palace guard. You all know that you don't have to be in a prison to feel trapped. But even in the spaces where you feel trapped, there'll be opportunities if you look for them. So that's the first thing in building the strength and some of our resilience to be able to stand whatever the circumstance. The second thing is this, to choose joy. Choose joy. Philippians as a book is nicknamed the Book of Joy, or the Epistle of Excellent Things, if you want something a little bit more lyrical. Theologians have come up with that name because in its 4 short chapters, Paul talks about rejoicing and joy 16 times. It's almost like in the context he's in where he's limited, he knows his limitations, he's stuck, he's in this prison, things might not look so good for him. He knows that even in that place, he wants to build joy and rejoice. Even from that context, he can have joy. Do you know that even in your context, however storm-like and grim it looks, you can have joy? Because joy is a supernatural thing given you by the power of the Holy Spirit. God can and will move in your life to bubble up a joy that comes from heaven. The question is, will you choose joy? Will you go after it? We can try and sum up what's going on with Paul here. He's got joy, he's rejoicing in this situation, and we could conclude either he's totally deceiving us. Maybe he's just deceiving the Philippians, deceiving us tonight as he writes this book to Philippi. And actually it's all just like he's just putting on a front and a smiling face, but behind there's no joy. In which case he would be lying. It could be that he's deluded. Maybe this kind of prison thing has put a bit too much pressure on him, and right now he's like gone a bit crazy. So he's deluded, and that's where the joy is coming from, in which case he would be mad. But as you read the book of Philippians, it doesn't read like the kind of person who's now mad. So he could be deluded, he could be deceiving, or more likely, he's utterly devoted. Paul has so given his whole heart to Jesus, his whole life. He's so devoted to Jesus that he's utterly convinced he can trust trust Jesus, whatever the circumstance. He's utterly convinced that even in this situation, Jesus will come through for him. He knows that the end game, whatever that end game is, will point to Jesus, because he knows that Christ loves him, is for him, has a plan for him. And consistently, because of that knowledge, he chooses joy over judgment. Do you know, it's so easy, isn't it? When things come against us, when the storms of life come and it feels unfair, or we feel limited and no freedom. And in Paul's case, he starts talking about people who are trying to stir up trouble for him. People who have got mixed motives about Jesus even. People who are trying to preach Jesus to other people, but to stir up trouble for Paul. That's the worst situation, isn't it? When you're misrepresented and when people are stirring up trouble against you, when they're making threats against you, going to take you to court or whatever else. When all of that stuff's happening, you can choose judgment or you can choose joy. If you choose judgment, you push people away, you bring division, and you break down the strength of whatever the circumstance. But you choose joy and say, God, I don't get all of this. I don't necessarily have every answer, but the thing I do know is that I can trust you. Come fill me with your spirit. Let joy bubble up again. Let me respond in joy and not judgment. You know, psychologists are catching up with this. A few thousand years later, as they're researching all these different areas and factors of life, psychologists have discovered that joy is a good thing. That we have agency to choose joy. It's not something that just comes upon us, that some of us have and some of us don't, but that you can actually choose and cultivate joy in your life. And they have discovered that joyful people cope more effectively with stress, are most usually healthier, and have increased levels of resilience. Choose joy, just like Paul. Choose joy. One of the key ways to cultivate joy is to look ahead, particularly if the present is so hard for you right now. Sometimes it can be hard to see just ahead, like what's going to look like next year, what's it going to look like in 3 weeks, because it can feel so intense when you're in a pressurized situation. But look even further ahead, just like Jesus. There's this beautiful verse in Hebrews 12 where it says of Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Jesus stepped into the biggest storm of his life as he moved towards laying down his life as a sacrifice on that cross. That all who would put their trust in him might have their sin washed away and find new life in Jesus. And what was the joy that was set before him? What enabled him to endure the intensity of that kind of pressure? To keep looking to his Father, whatever the circumstance. It was the joy set before him. What was the joy? You. You are the joy set before him. You are. You're the joy. You see, Jesus looked ahead and he knew that if I go through the cross here, if I go through with this act, I will open up a way that each and every person can respond and put their trust in me, and I can speak on their behalf. I can take judgment so they can have joy. I can take hold of all of them and bring them to eternity forevermore. The future looks bright if I push through this cross. So you are the joy of Jesus Christ. And he sees you and he knows you and he calls you to himself, and he will establish you for all eternity, even beyond this life. To take you to a place where there is no more pain, no more suffering, no more tears, but the fullness of life itself. Which takes us to our third area. Because see, just as Jesus was looking to that eternal perspective, so Paul does as well. And the third area is to think eternal. If you want to survive, thrive, establish whatever the circumstance, you spot an opportunity, you choose joy, and you think eternal. I love verse 20, where Paul says this, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. To live is Christ, to die is gain. For the Christian, there is no end in death. And Paul knew it. That's why he could say to die was to be gaining, because he knew that he would be with Jesus forevermore. And he grapples in this passage like, actually, part of me just wants to go and be with Christ right now. So actually, if this whole execution thing goes ahead, it's not such a bad thing, because Christ will be glorified in me and I get to be with him for all eternity. That's why to die would be to gain. But to live, well, to live is to say, I'm all in. And Paul had arrived at that situation. He was like, I am all in. You can't stop me. I met Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. I've seen him working in my life. I've seen him heal people, save people, deliver people. I've seen churches explode. This thing has got momentum and it's not stopping anytime soon. And I am all in. Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, Paul would say. So whether in life or death, he was going to allow himself to be the theater of Jesus' glory. Whatever it took. Probably the closest I've ever personally seen this verse at work, to live is Christ and to die is gain, is in my brother Mark. Mark was a popular teenager, sporty and kind of doing well in life, and somewhere in his teens he found Jesus and asked Jesus to come into his life. It began to change things significant, and he grew in his commitment to Jesus, but he himself would say it was a bit half-hearted. It was kind of there, kind of not. It wasn't necessarily all in all the time. And he began a degree to study law. And halfway through the degree, he got diagnosed with cancer. The headaches had become so intense that he had to get further checkups, and they discovered a huge brain tumor. It was a shock and it was devastating for our family. He was treated in a specialist unit in Oxford and suffered and struggled and had to push through for a long time. And on a couple of occasions, our family were prepared that he wouldn't make it through the night. And he was reduced to almost nothing. Unbelievably and utterly miraculously, in answer to prayer, Mark pulled through. And as he was slowly recovering, having had his lifetime dose of radiotherapy, he had this dream. And in this dream, he saw an African pastor come to him, and his Bible was open, and say, "Brother Mark, we need you to come and teach us the Bible." And when he woke up, he knew this wasn't just the cheese from the night before. He knew that this was God's call on his life. He knew that there was this call to step forwards and to step into what God was calling him to, even though that probably filled him with fear and threw up his future into all kinds of, well, does this mean I can carry on with law or not? What does that look like? And as he recovered, he was managed to be able to go back to university to complete his degree. And he traveled out to Uganda on one of his summer holidays. And when he was in Uganda, he was sitting reading his Bible, and an African pastor came to him and said, "Brother Mark, we need you to come and teach us the Bible." And he knew this was God's call. This man, Lumika, together with his wife, Rebecca, had planted a church in a remote area of the Ruwenzori Mountains, where very few people would travel to go, no tourists would ever go. And Mark went back and traveled with him and knew God was calling him into this space. And this church had begun, but they didn't even have any Bibles. They had no theology. They didn't know anything except Jesus is Lord, and that's about as much as they traded on. So there's all sorts of things going on in the church that Mark was like slightly surprised at, but knew that he had to come, knew that he had to go. And this pastor was saying, "Please come." And so the journey began, and he knew this was God's call. He knew that he'd been saved from that cancer to be all in for Christ. To live is Christ. That was his life now. And so he was happy to lay down the law thing. He knew that wasn't the call for him. It might be your call, but it wasn't his call. And so he started training, and he gave everything he could to make sure he was equipped for that role. And he traveled in and out of Uganda. And then he got married to the wonderful Sophie, who also felt a call to go with him to Africa. And Mark and Sophie began ministry in Africa. They began working with this church network, training pastors, and they lived out in the Ruwenzori Mountains and Kampala as well, and they began this work. And over the course of 10 years, things began to evolve and things started happening, and it was extraordinary, and there was so much encouragement, and it was radical. It was living it out. It was all in. To live is Christ. And then they came back to England for a routine kind of bit of training, and Mark had a check at the hospital and was shocked to discover that the cancer had returned. 10 years on, the brain tumor had come back, and it was a surprise to all of us because we believed he'd been healed. And I remember Christmas, 2004. Mark was wrapped in blankets and hat on his head because he just couldn't keep his heat in anymore. His body was ravished by the treatment. And he leant in and just whispered to me, "Pete, God has called me on a new adventure." And I thought, what's this? You're already doing extraordinary things, and the Untitled Mountains are exploding because of all that you and Sophie are putting in, and Lumika and Rebecca, and the work's incredible. What more could you add? It wasn't until 4 weeks later, when we all stood around his bed and he took his final breath, that I realized he knew he was going to die. And he died with such faith and peace that even in that circumstance, he brought glory to Jesus. It was devastating, it's painful, there are still questions. Life isn't straightforward or easy for any of us. But the most incredible thing is that 18 months later, I traveled out to Uganda with his wife, Sophie. I had 2 small children. James was only 3 months old when Mark died. And my other brother came too. And we arrived in this remote area of the Untitled Mountains and gathered in for a memorial service to which hundreds, thousands of people all came, some traveling like 12 hours by foot to be there. Such was the impact of his life. Too short, but most beautifully lived. That church network had been 12 churches when Mark and Sophie had come back to England, expecting to go back just a month or 2 later. By the time we got there for that memorial service, there were now 60 churches. And many of those churches were being led by men and women that Mark and Sophie had invested in and trained. Such was the multiplication that happened. A number of them are called St. Mark's. I'm not sure if he's allowed to be canonized, but it's been a joy to see his boys, both teenagers now, give their lives to Jesus and get baptized over the last few years and speak of Mark's influence in their lives, even though they didn't even know him. You see, our lives multiply more than we could ever know. And even when we suffer, when we experience darkness and hardship, we're forced to dig deeper. And you discover more about who you really are, who God really is, and what he has in store for life for you. Paul pulled it all together in that beautiful phrase, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Mark knew to live is Christ, to die is gain. And his legacy continues to multiply, just as Paul's legacy continues to multiply. The big difference was that was the end for Mark. In this situation in Philippians, it wasn't the end for Paul. And so he concludes, it's not time for me to go yet. I've got more to do. I want to bring more joy to this world. I want to see the gospel flourish and advance. I know that God, although I'd love to be with him full time in eternity, has got plans for me here. And he's got plans for you here too. Every single one of you. You have a precious one life. Every single day is an absolute gift. And if you choose, whatever the circumstance, to spot the opportunity, to choose joy, and to think eternal, then the sky's the limit. Whatever storm moves in on your horizon, whatever circumstance arrives, you can stand firm and know the fullness of life in Jesus Christ. Amen.